Is it recording now? Okay. So hello. Today this is Terra Center with our fourth interview of professors who are experts on Russian politics and Russian geopolitics specifically. Today we have Dr. Gregory Simon, an associate professor at the University of Uppsala in Sweden, and he's written a lot regarding Russian and Eurasian studies, especially how Russia is trying to project itself with power, and sort of what's going on with Russian media and sort of soft and hard power projection. So that being said, is there anything else you'd like to add before you jump straight into the questions?
No, that sounds about right.
Okay. Okay. So that being said, we'll begin. So as you well know, so in the 21st century, soft power is usually just used over direct military force. We see this a lot, for example, China trying to project itself economically rather than militarily. So apropos of that, so what exactly has Russia's strategy been in order to project its strength? So we know they do heavy investments in the military, but do you think this is the wrong approach and they should invest more in soft power and opening up private enterprise, or is it good that they're just investing in the military for direct hard power?
Well, I mean, the idea of soft power has been relatively late in being picked up by Russia. I mean, you didn't have discussions about it in the early 2000s. I mean, these came only from about 5 years ago, maybe a little bit more. And so this idea of soft power. And it's also been not quite the same as the concept of soft power that was given by Nye, because Nye is talking about soft power as being generated by not the whole, not only the state, but also private enterprise and so forth. So, I mean, Hollywood and all these things. And so this has been one of his criticisms of Russia, that it's not really engaging in soft power because the same, entity within the market. You don't have a large private sector. And I mean, although I'd say that's not very accurate, because I mean, one of the criticisms that the state doesn't support things like arts and culture and so forth. But I mean, Russia and, for example, China have a history of the state supporting these things, because this is one of the things that the state does. I mean, Russia, especially if you look at it, is projecting this idea of soft power, which is related to its culture. And I mean, if we're looking at high cultures, so you've got opera, arts, these kinds of things, as well as literature. So, I mean, this is where the emphasis is. But, I mean, you've also got a use of its power. I mean, if you're looking at the West now, there's much less talk about soft power per se, but rather smart power. So this is a combination of hard and soft. And you can see that, because if you look at it, hard power can actually bring soft power under certain circumstances. And to give an example where that has actually happened for Russia is in the Syrian conflict, because it's deployed a military force there to shore up the Syrian government, to prevent it from falling, like what happened in Libya. And what you have there is a lot of soft power which has come from that, because Russia is now a credible foreign actor in the Middle East and North Africa, because it backed what it was saying with, for example, if we back to 2012, Obama drew his red line, but then didn't enforce it, which meant that the US lost a lot of its credibility and its ability to be a moderator or this go-between in the Middle East. And you can see, I mean, recently you had the King of Saudi Arabia visit Putin in Moscow. So, I mean, this is an expression where soft power has come from the use of hard power. And I mean, looking at how and Russia communicates to the outside world, there's a lot less emphasis which is put on traditional diplomacy, that state-to-state diplomacy, because you have a completely dysfunctioning global level of diplomacy, because everyone's accusing the other of undermining democracy or undermining the state or trying to subvert the other. And so that there is little trust. There is each side is sanctioning the other side for different things, and you have this tit for tat, which is just escalating like this. So where the main focus is now, I mean, if you look, it's the public diplomacy. And for example, you can see during the coronavirus, this was used as a public diplomacy exercise, because when you had Italy, for example, which was one of the countries which Russia gave aid and help to, I mean, they gave aid and help to Italy, which wasn't being given by the European Union, even though Italy is a member of the European Union. So once more, I mean, you have this coming around the main system, the political system, and reaching more to the popular level. I mean, there are some countries where Russia is more popular than others, socially or culturally conservative. And so especially if you look in South Asia and places like this. But also, I mean, if you look also in the US, there are some interesting trends as well, because I mean, I think it was Pew that were doing polls, and this was, do you believe that, and they asked both Democrats and Republicans, do you believe that Russia interfered with your elections? And I mean, the majority on both sides said yes, but it was interesting to see the effect. I mean, Democrats have always been rather critical or negative towards Russia. If you want to call it, approval rating dropped, but because of the belief that Russia interfered with the elections. But on the other side, Republicans increased their support for Russia because precisely they believed that Russia had interfered with the elections. So, I mean, you have the same action but completely different results. And you can see this happening now. I mean, how it plays out with international institutions like the United Nations, and this political jam on at the level, but there are other things that are going on at the level of interaction between the popular level, people to people.
Yeah, and you talked a lot about like this idea of like power subversion and like overall projections of like this image of democracy for Russia. How exactly has Russia formed a sort of PR program, I guess, and like try to project this image that they are like more democratic or amicable than other countries? And how effective do you think this has been overall at like changing perceptions and paradigms of Russia and other countries?
Okay, I mean, Russia has changed its different approach to how it tries to project its international image. If we go back to the beginning of the 21st century, so I mean, this was the time when it was transitioning from Yeltsin, the first president, to Putin. And I mean, up until that point, there was no real thought to rehabilitate Russia's international image. I mean, they did not have the money, firstly, and secondly, it was not a political priority. But when Putin was elected to president in 2000, then you had a slight change. I mean, you had the economy improved somewhat better than it was, and there were more clear political directions about where they wanted to be and where they wanted to go. And I mean, contrary to what a lot of people project, Putin back in 2000 was not hostile to the West. If anything, was a Westerner. And you can see this because he was trying to integrate into the World Trade Organization. He was going from what was G7 to G8, which is back to G7 again. So, I mean, Russia was actually integrating into the global liberal system. And, I mean, well, everyone can remember those interesting remarks by George Bush Jr. about the effects of looking into Putin's eyes. So, I mean, you can see, I mean, it was a different time, it was a different era. And, I mean, you had this G7, which became G8 meeting in St. Petersburg. Russia was using public relations more than public diplomacy at this stage to do its thing. And interestingly, it was not using domestic organizations or companies to promote itself. I mean, it's using foreign ones. I mean, one of the more renowned ones was Ketchum, the US-based lobbying firm. So, I mean, this gradually soured, but Russia began to develop its own ability to communicate to the world. And you had different indicators that this was going to happen. And one of these was the idea of creating its own ability to communicate with broadcasting to the outside world. So, I mean, this Russia Today, which has become RT, was one of those priorities which was created. And I mean, so, I mean, the idea was to, as the Russians put it, correct the distorted image of Russia internationally. So, I mean, in this regard, I mean, the purpose behind RT is not that much different from what you get, for example, with the British BBC as a concept, that RT is this public diplomacy asset to reach to the outside world. And you can see what kinds of foreign policy priorities Russia has simply by looking at the languages which RT broadcasts in. So, I mean, you have English. The next language was, I think, Arabic. Then the third language was Spanish. And now you got a bunch of other ones, which include French, German, and so forth. But this gives an indication of these different priorities. And, I mean, there were, I mean, it's been a gradual cooling of relations between Russia. I mean, you had that brief attempt by Hillary Clinton and this public relations stunt, the reset, where they have that funny little button, which I've actually seen that button. It's in the Diplomatic Academy of the Russian Federation. They've got it on display. But yeah, so I mean, you had these kinds of publicity things, which, I mean, it's one of those things. Russia and the United States have a long history of antagonism, with the occasional periods where they cooperate or collaborate for very looking at it now, not only RT, but a network of different, as NGOs, but more probably you would call gongos, the government organized NGOs. but also these different think tanks and searches. So I mean, this idea of reinvigorating somewhat these elements of research, but I mean, they're not only research, these are also soft power. I mean, like education system, it's bringing a lot of different foreign students each year. And I mean, you can broadly call this education diplomacy. So a lot of people may know from contacts in Africa or South Asia and so forth, have had the university in the Russian Federation, whether as journalists, doctors, or something like this. I mean, it's the same principle for the United States. I mean, you have scholarships and ability for foreign students to come to the United States for an education, but the education is not only formal, but informal, because you pick up some aspects of culture and these particular points that you do not do as a tourist, for example. And yeah, and I mean, you can see, I mean, in terms of networks, Russia, as well as China, I mean, they're working more towards this concept of what they call a post-unipolar world. So, I mean, this unipolar world came with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, which was a bipolar world. And so if we look from 1991, and some say until at least the first close to decade of the 21st century, the United States is, well, it still is the biggest power, but it's been more contested now, non-Western powers. So you've got the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, there is the BRICS, the organization. You've got these different things which are being created parallel to the US-dominated ones like the World Bank and these kinds of organizations. I mean, there are different ways of going around it, and one can see that now that US and Western actions in general have pushed Russia further from the West, more towards the East, and in particular to China. And well, this is, some have criticized this because they argue, well, combination of Russia and China, where Russia as a junior partner to China, creates a problem for the United States and the West, because Russia's superior military technology, for example, can be mass-produced in China. And so you've got these other different aspects which make it a relatively poor choice strategically and for the medium to long term, especially when you have a relative Western decline. And so what we see at the moment, different countries are trying to position themselves during this coronavirus. I mean, you have this battle of the vaccines, who can get the vaccine first, and all these crazy different competitions. So, I mean, it's more on an emotional basis. I mean, it's partly on prestige. You're getting international politics which are being waged by prestige, but also a little bit by the feeling of threat, and that is the US feels its position is being eroded, and so is taking actions to stop that. I mean, you can see what is going to the US debate about what should be done. Should the US, I mean, where Trump has withdrawn somewhat from the US being the global hegemon and fully engaged in international affairs, to the idea that Biden wants to get back into this and try and restore what had been, say, 10, 15 years ago, where US is more active on the international stage. But yeah, so it's going to be quite, should we say, interesting to see where this goes. The main point, if we look at where the discussions are going internationally, both sides are talking over it, and the main conversation is not going at the political level where decisions, sensible decisions, can be made rather than emotional ones.
Okay, thanks. So playing off of the soft and hard power, so Russia's obviously been increasingly active in the Middle East, especially in Libya and Syria. So you said that Russia gained a bit in Syria through business and soft power adventures, but what exactly are Russia's interests in these countries? What does it have to gain by spreading its influence there?
Well, look, there are different gains. One, they can use their increased influence and presence in the Middle East and North Africa as leverage against Western-led sanctions. So, I mean, this is political leverage to try and bargain. But also, I mean, this is part of Russia's more drift from the West. So Russia is seeking non-Western powers with which to interact with. So you have, I mean, India, Pakistan, China, Brazil, these kinds of up-and-coming powers which are non-Western, and this is heading towards what they believe is a multipolar global order. So, I mean, you have a unipolar one which is currently transforming to something multipolar, but this is not an even one because there are some countries who are much more powerful. It's not like the bipolar world order where you have two somewhat equal powers which control the world. Multipolar, and you get this in the Middle East. I mean, the United States has lost a lot of influence relatively quickly in the Middle East and North Africa. And I mean, quite frankly, a lot of the Arab governments and bureaucracies are very wary of the United States because they believe that the US was using this to push its geopolitical program. And by this, I mean regime change. So, I mean, if we're looking at what happened in Tunisia, in Libya, in Egypt, I mean, they are suspicious about that. And so there's a bit of pushback in that regard. I mean, one can see now, I mean, what Libya has done by regime changing Gaddafi, that they've created a whole new power vacuum there. I mean, initially this was filled by mostly different jihadist forces that then started to spread to other North African countries, Algeria and other neighboring states. But also now, if we look what's happening, it's creating this geopolitical rivalry between, for example, Turkey, Russia, and Egypt and Turkey, and I mean, it's a huge mess. It's created a lot of additional instability. Another reason for Russia to get more involved is purely financial interests. Exporting technology, nuclear power plants, for example, to the region, exporting goods, to importing goods from the region. So you have purely financial interests as well. Not everything is purely about politics, but by having good political relations, other relations are possible, such as economic.
Great. So I guess that leads us into one last question. Where overall, what do you think Russia's like geopolitical strategy is in terms of like getting involved in like Eastern European countries and in the Middle East?
Um, well, I mean, I mean, what do I think? Why are they getting involved?
Yeah, like what do you think their long-term goals are when it comes to promoting,
Okay.
getting more involved?
Well, I mean, Russia has a number of things. I mean, if we look at what's been happening in the neighborhood around Russia, so what happened recently there, I mean, this is one thing where you got the security dynamic, where there's little trust between Russia and the West. On the one hand, you got the West accusing Russia of interfering in other countries around not only its near abroad, what it's referred to as former Soviet Union, but more broadly speaking. Uh, and then you got accusations from Russia that the West is and other countries are getting involved in its area of interest. I mean, this can be, for example, clearly seen what's been happening in Belarus recently, which is an interesting example because, on the one hand, you have uh, a very clear color revolution, which is happening in Belarus. And it's interesting to see how, I mean, the timeline, what has been happening. Because if we go to the first point, well, I mean, Mike Pompeo visited Lukashenko just before elections. And so, I mean, this has been pointed to as something greater than a coincidence. But also, I mean, you had a number of what you call false flags. If you know what a false flag is, okay, false flag is you create a situation that looks like an enemy is attacking you. For example, if we look at how the 1939 German invasion of Poland occurred, that's a good false flag because you had some people dressed up in Polish army uniforms attack a German radio station on the border. And this was used as a pretext for Germany to invade Poland. And if we look at the false flag which occurred in Belarus, I mean, you had that bizarre story about Russian mercenaries getting arrested in Minsk. And when you look into the story, okay, who were these Russian mercenaries? Okay, these are all people who had been fighting in eastern Ukraine against the Kiev government. Okay, and then they were flying into Minsk, and then they were told their flight was delayed to go into town, went to a hotel, and were arrested by the Belarusian security services. But then you dig deeper into it. Who were these people? Well, there was said that they're Russian mercenaries. Very few of them are actually Russian. Most of them are Ukrainian citizens. So, and they were transiting Belarus, Minsk. They weren't. That was not their final destination. Who paid for the air tickets of these people? Well, that came from a travel agency in Kiev, in Ukraine. So, I mean, once you start putting these things together, then one starts to understand. And recently, you've seen what Lukashenko, Belarus president, did. He closed the borders with Poland and Lithuania, both of them who have been running a long campaign of public diplomacy as a means for regime change. And I mean, I've seen these things in practice, not just read about it. And then Ukraine, that border has been strictly monitored I mean, you got those points. And yeah, so I mean, you have these rising tensions. And I mean, you have a lot of accusations. Russia did this, or United States did that. But a lot of it is a red herring. I mean, if you look at the substance, for example, of the Mueller report, it fell apart quickly because it was built on a very flimsy basis. And so, I mean, the idea of this is a short name, something substantial. And you can also look at what the intelligence community is. They're not all agreeing with it, but then you accept wording where there is confidence that there is some veracity to this being true, or something along these lines. So it's very elusive wording. Now, I mean, Russia, yeah, sure, it does prefer to have friendly or at least neutral neighbours, and that this has been changed. If we look at 2014 with Ukraine, I mean, this was one of the points which really plunged things up. Are they going to start out these scenarios which are being predicted by such dubious organizations, or as prop or not, and these other different ones, which are to recreate the Soviet Union or recreate the Russian Empire? Well, no, this is not going to be the case, because Russia, in terms of its population, in terms of its economic and military power, is not the Soviet Union. It does not have those same capacity and resources. Instead, I mean, it's become much more pragmatically oriented. It gave up ideology, which was a central part of the Soviet Union, for pragmatic things, and often on a bilateral basis as opposed to other bases. But I mean, this is changing. So now you can see that there are different things going on. For example, if we look at the attempts to stop the Nord Stream 2 pipeline in Germany, I mean, this is a purely geo-economic fight. If the Russian pipeline in the United States has a large market to export, if it does not, then it cannot take advantage of that market. So, I mean, a lot of these things, I mean, foreign policy is one of the most abused areas of the political world. You have the most wonderful and beautiful and eloquent reasons for doing something, which mask the really dirty, underhand and unethical goals. Certainly, what you see is the shiny surface. Rub it a bit, you start much more ugly, which the public don't usually see.
Great. Well, I think that's all the time we have. So thank you so much for joining us and giving us a little bit more insight into some of Russian politics and their power projections, that kind of thing.
My pleasure. It's a very complex thing. It's I don't consider myself completely fluent in it yet, but I mean, I've been going there for over 20 years now, and so I'm not completely green. There are far few things that surprise me in the world these days as a result. But yeah, I mean, a lot of these things now, I mean, you've got a game which is occurring underneath the facade. So, I mean, this is the main thing to keep in mind, and that you need to dig around in sources which might not normally go into. I mean, one of the things I used to teach my students who took a class, mass media and contemporary armed conflict, I'd say, okay, this event happened on this particular day. I want you to check this source from Russia, this source from the US, this one from the UK, one from your home country. Tell me what you find. And I mean, you get responses like, well, if you didn't tell me this was the one event, I would think that these different media sources were talking about completely different events. Because that's the whole idea about media. What is it? Is it about objectivity and truth, or is it about influencing people? And it tends to be more about influencing people than telling the objective truth so people can make up their own mind. I mean, it always has. There was I mean, if you get a chance to read it, by Edward Bernays, The Engineering of Public Consent. There is the timing and the content of news. I mean, it's all about engineering consent.
But yeah, I'm so sorry to cut you off. We have to head to class soon, so I think we're gonna have to head out. But thank you so much for talking to us.
I also wanted to thank you so much. It was super interesting to get.
It was useful.
It was super interesting to get the more Russian perspective also.
I'm glad to help out, and good luck with your studies and your or video, however you're going to. If you want to send me a link to it after you have done, I'd be glad. No, thank you. So, looking forward to seeing the results of the interview. Thanks. Good luck with your studies.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.